Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Deviant Mind. This is Dominika.
And this is Christopher.
And sorry that we've been gone for the last 6 weeks, but my entire family got hit with COVID one by one. Like we all dropped,
Yes.
and it has taken this long for me to actually be able to talk for any length of time. So,
Yes.
thanks for being patient with me, Chris, and
Of
our
course. And
listeners.
thank you. Thank you for keeping in touch. I'm just glad you guys are on the mends.
Yeah. So it's been a really crappy summer, but I guess, it sounds like COVID is on the rise everywhere. So should be
Yeah.
a fun a fun a
Not
fun
going
fall.
anywhere.
Fun fall. It's gonna be a fun fall.
Yeah.
So we have kind of a really interesting case today that I've actually been very interested in for a number of years. I actually had a producer from England come contact me about maybe making a feature film on this woman and never went anywhere. But I always was so like fascinated is not really the best word to use, but it was kind of this very strange time in history where you just don't think things like that ever happened. And the way that we see children is so different than they did a long time ago. So, without
Yeah.
further ado, this is Amelia Dyer, and she was, I think, dubbed the baby farm killer. Um,
Yes.
yes. And so baby farms, that's a weird word or weird two words put together. So I think maybe what we should start with is this is back in the 19th century.
Yeah.
And there
Victorian
was,
England.
what was that?
Victorian England.
Victorian England. However, I did find out that there were also baby farms in the United States,
That's correct.
which was kind of interesting. So a baby farm is essentially came from the fact that there was a lot of societal pressure and stigma associated with illegitimate children. And so unmarried mothers would find it extremely difficult to keep and raise their children because many of them had to work and there was no means to care for the child. And there was only so many workhouses and orphanages that were around. So in the 19th century, baby farming emerged as a business. And a baby farm was a woman or couples would take in multiple children and would get paid by the government or the mothers. And they promised to provide care or to arrange adoptions for those children. But really, most of them were driven by profits. And most of the time, the children were often neglected, malnourished, or deliberately killed because dead children did not require food, care, or attention.
I
And
also want to throw in here
yes,
that in 1834, uh, Victorian England had a Poor Law Amendment Act, a Poor Law, rather, Amendment Act, which is when uh, women were to get food and good living conditions from the parish, a lot of them working for wealthy families, because that was the best job for most women at the time. Uh, but they did not want mothers working for them. So
right.
this is what prompted them to sometimes go to work and leave babies with these farms, with the idea that they would come back later. So
Yes.
if you got off work or a couple days later, you'd go back and check on your kid, make sure they were okay. And a lot of these women and mothers were overwhelmed by taking care of all the babies. And the baby farmers needed the money because without the money to feed and clothe them properly, that's when the children fell off into neglect. And a lot of these farms had way more babies than they could care for. There was no breast milk readily available, which already can alter a child's upbringing. And, in a lot of cases, as we'll discuss, if the baby passed away, uh, they just kept the money and allowed a new baby into the farm. So they would just keep going. That was common practice. If the baby passed away at the baby farm, oops, sorry, you just keep going.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And from this case, because this was the most infamous case, because she is believed to have murdered hundreds of infants over a 20-year period. There were regulations and acts that were put in place. There was a Infant Life Protection Act of 1872. Even though she was caught in, what was it, 1890? Hold on, I believe it was 1896. Yeah, she was caught in 1896 because, well, we'll go into how she was caught. But there were acts that actually started looking into baby farming, and it was, again, there was the Infant Life Protection Act that happened, and the Adoption of Children Act of 1926, which was the first law in Britain that regulated adoption. And before this, the adoptions were often informal agreements, which were going, between baby farmers. And as we said before, there was Australia and the United States also had baby farming going on. Again,
interesting to note that at this time, men were completely okay to impregnate women out of wedlock, yet they had no responsibility.
Yes.
So in other words, they were able to leave, they could do what they want, and they bore no responsibility on the child nor the mother. They created the baby with.
Yes, exactly. So she, as we said, was she was the kind of the face of this throughout time. And why don't we start with how she was finally, like the case that finally caught her, and go from there.
By the way, interesting to note that quote unquote strangle adopting was a term that got around for the practice of killing babies and children. I mean, we have to understand when we step back, there were approximately 2,000 baby farms at one time in the 19th century in England. And if the baby passed away, they oftentimes didn't know who to contact. They were unable to contact these single mothers. Single mothers, you were an outcast, basically.
Yeah.
It was unforgivable. So by the same token, what's the difference? They lost their baby, they dropped it off with us. So that became a common thing. You just dispose of the babies and you bring in new money. I mean, let's dive into how she was caught, and then we can back up into what she was doing, because her life is just really fraught with a lot of abuse and craziness. Her mother suffered mental breakdowns, and she wound up taking care of her mother. And in the process, she felt the need to take care of others and got into nursing. So that's really interesting. That was kind of the springboard. Her mother's own health prompted her to become a nurse. But let's dive into how we're talking 400 bodies. Okay, we're talking 400 murders. That's what they estimate.
Right, which they estimate, but that most of those were not found. The case that she was caught on was they found 6 infants in a river, and this happened in Reading. The place where she was working was Reading in Bristol. And on the March 30th, 1896, in Reading, there was a bargeman who was navigating up a river, and he was towing a boat. And when they were coming close to the towpath, they spotted a brown paper parcel in the water. And so they grabbed it. And when they unraveled it, they found, this is very specific. It was a damp parcel. It was tied with macrame twine. And when they cut through 2 layers of flannel and fabric, they found a child's foot and part of a leg. So they found a tiny baby in the water. And so they, of course, called the police constable, which they came within 15 minutes from the Reading police station. And they took it back to the mortuary, and they unwrapped it to find a body of a baby girl who was aged between 6 months and 1 year. And she had been strangled with tape, and she was later identified as Helena Fry. Now, there were three detectives that were on this case. There was a detective constable, James Anderson, and there was another one named George Toolsley and Sergeant Harry James. And so when they unwrapped the paper, they were able to decipher very faint handwriting. And it read Mrs. Thomas, 26 Piggott's Road, Caversham.
I also want to point out that it was her common practice in disposing of the bodies to tape them, suffocate them, wrap them in paper, and then she would often put a rock or a stone. And in this case, that was not there. And Elena Fry's body did not sink. So her body was floating. So we have the mistake of her having her address on the inside of the paper, and she also fails to put the rock in, and the body doesn't sink, making it easy for this fella to find the body.
That's right. That's right. So when the police went to that address, they found that this Mrs. Thomas no longer lived there. But one of the detective constable, James Anderson, said, "Hey, you know what? Let's take this parcel to the Reading railway station to see where it might have come from." And because the package bore a Midland Railway stamp and a date. And so the railway clerk found the entry of the parcel in his ledger. And he was the one that told Mrs. Thomas's real name was Mrs. Dyer. And she now lived at 45 Kensington Road, which was on the other side of Reading. Now, they didn't immediately go and arrest her. They decided to watch her house. And on the 3rd of April, when she appeared at the property, they used a female decoy to come and see about adopting a child, because Amelia Dyer was already a well-known baby farmer. And again, baby farms were not against the law. So this decoy, she made an appointment, and she said that there was able to adopt. And when the lady arrived for the appointment, the detective constable Anderson and Harry James were on her doorstep, and they actually brought her into custody on suspicion of murder. Now, while she was in custody, there were 5 other bodies that were washed up. There were bodies of 2 more babies that were together in a carpet bag. Hold on a second. Oh, and
if I may, also, I'd like to back up a little bit to 18. Let's see, this happens 1895, right? In 1879, she had been caught by some doctors that noticed a number of deaths weren't actually reported in her ledger, and they thought that was very suspicious. So they kept an eye on her, and she eventually did 6 months of hard labor for neglect of those children from the doctor's report. And after release, she continued, but this time she didn't report any deaths on the ledger, and she continued to do that. And instead, she hid the bodies in the tanks, and which is where this body was seen, where Elena Fry's body was in the tank. That was her choice of dumping grounds, was the Thames River.
That's right, because I actually read about that, and she had originally thought that starving the babies to death would be fine, because that's natural death. And because there were so many that were happening, the doctors did not want to sign off on the death certificates, because essentially the children were dying of starvation. So
starvation, also a drug by the name of Lanina, which was a painkiller, and it was basically the aspirin of the 19th century. And it was used by a lot of baby farms to silence babies. However, it caused constipation and greatly impacted the bowels. It was an opium-based drug, and it basically provided no way for these babies to survive, because they used this in place of food, like stop crying, you're not going to eat, they'll be okay. But they became malnourished and would often pass away from this painkiller. Who,
Yeah.
a witch rather, she took herself. She eventually became addicted to this painkiller. And sometimes she'd cover the nose and mouth of newborns. So it appeared that they were stillborn.
I see. Yeah. So, sorry, this is a dark one, guys.
It's a real dark one. It's a real dark one. And after 1879, when the doctors come, they do this thing. She serves 6 months. That's when she starts the process of all the drumming up all these aliases, changing her location. She knows that eventually, if she was caught now, she has to change her location. She continued to put ads in the paper. Hey, are you a mother? Look at it. Her ads were extremely popular. And she had, at one point, I think over 600 babies at one point.
Yeah, which is, again, where do you even house all those children?
Unbelievable.
Yeah. And, when she got released from the hard labor, she actually tried to resume her nursing career. And unfortunately, she was completely nuts. So she was a former asylum nurse. So she was both a nurse and she also was in mental hospitals because she was kept being put in there for mental instability and suicidal tendencies.
Yes. Which spawned from her upbringing.
Yes.
If I can, to dive back, she did come from a large family, and they were more fortunate than most. Her father, Samuel Hobley, was able to send his children to school. And this is at a time when only 25% of children attended school. So she and her siblings are able to go. She's one of, I believe, 7 kids. She had 3 brothers and 3 sisters. 2 of her sisters had died when she was 5. And the youngest, Sarah, passed away when she was 9. It was around this time the mother that she loved, Sarah, got typhus and fever, headaches, delirium. She had this deadly disease, basically declining so slowly with the father at work, the siblings at school. Amelia actually that's when she becomes her mother's full-time caregiver. And at 11, her mother dies. So at 9, she loses a sister. At 11, she loses her mom. And she continued school until she was 14, moved to Bristol to become an apprentice. And that's when she becomes a nurse and meets a friend. She befriends an Ellen Dane, who's a trained midwife. And she not only delivered babies, but ran not a baby farm, but a house, which was pretty much controlled. And she stayed there until the birth. And then she was charged with faith. So basically, Amelia saw this, the strategy and adopted it.
Yeah.
For her.
And she did also have a daughter who she used in the scheme. But I don't think she was ever charged, even though there was always suspicion that she knew exactly what was happening. And because she
worked at Dane's house until eventually until she had gotten pregnant with her first daughter.
Right.
And that was in 1864. She's 26 years old, gives birth to Ellen. And then her husband, Amelia's husband,
Arthur Palmer,
passed away.
Oh, no.
Yes.
Amelia's husband, William Dyer.
Well, I think it was George Thomas she marries first.
Okay.
She's 24 and he's 59. And then in 1869, when Ellen is 5, George Thomas dies.
That's
so
right.
Amelia needed income. And then rather than the nursery, that's when she first opened her baby farm.
Right. So they were able to discover, so when they finally brought her into custody, they were able to discover that she had taken in 20 children in the previous months that were nowhere to be found. So they felt that that they had gotten the right woman, and they calculated, and this was when they calculated that because she had done this over decades, that it was over 400 babies and children. And she was arrested on the 4th of April and charged with murder. And her son-in-law, Arthur Palmer, was charged as an accessory. And so the Thames was dredged. And actually, that's when they found the 6 more bodies after the 2 bodies were washed up in the carpet bag. Some of them were identified. There was Doris Marmon and Harry Simmons, who were supposedly her last victims. And at this point, her modus operandi was strangling with white tape, which was tape that was used, like edging tape used in dressmaking. And she said she found that just wrapping it twice around the baby's neck and tying a knot would do the deed.
Going back to what you said earlier, yes, she does in fact remarry William Dyer, and he loses his job. She marries in 1872. In 1870, a Margaret Launders was hanged for baby killing on her baby farm. And this sent shockwaves throughout the entire baby farm community, including Amelia. And that's actually what prompts her for getting back into nursing. And she goes to the Bristol Lunatic Asylum just because she's so afraid, like everything's happening with these baby farms. I got to get out, but maybe they'll catch me. That's when she gets back into farming. But then her husband, her second husband, loses his job. And that's when she's like, I got to get back into the baby farming. Like, it's just way more lucrative than what I'm doing now. Also, at this time in Victorian England, interesting to note, there was kind of like this weird ghetto where anyone who was poor and impoverished, they would all, because apparently the government said, hey, if you're downtrodden, don't worry, we have a place for you to get your act together. You go through training, you'll have menial jobs, but at least you'll be doing something. No beds, hardly any bathrooms. And there were thousands of people that were sort of gathered into this huge institution. And it was insane. You had families sleeping together, horrible conditions, and they would work for nothing. Like, they got very little pay. So these people were just kind of ignored. So that's another thing is that, you have the mothers living in this place. You have these fathers who are destitute. They give the babies to the baby farms, and they actually don't care what happens, right? I mean, to me, it reminds me of adopting a pet and then just, whatever, and letting the pet go. But now we're dealing with babies. Like, I can't deal with this baby, so whatever happens, happens. And there was just such a great divide between the wealth and the poverty during this time in Victorian England that it's just horrifying that this notion of baby farming. I mean, it's not even an orphanage, because we're not talking about adopting out to families who want to take care of these kids. We're talking about charging up to 80 pounds a baby a week to continue. Hey, we need money for food. Hey, we need clothes. And they keep getting money from these single mothers. Horrible system and a horrible time in the 19th century for Victorian England.
Well, and this is also the time of Jack the Ripper. So
yeah.
She was actually, there were some ripperologists who put her name down, like she could be one of them. Obviously, there's no proof of that, but and she doesn't figure prominently among the Jack the Ripper suspects, but her name has been thrown around by that. Now, when she was arrested and tried, she was actually the one who there was no evidence found that her daughter Marianne or Arthur Palmer, her husband, had acted as her accomplices. And she actually, Arthur Palmer was discharged because she wrote a confession about it, that neither of them had anything to do with what she was doing, which is not the case, because the murder that she pleaded guilty to was that of Doris Marmon. It was not even Helen Fry who brought the cops to her door. So Doris Marmon. So her mother was named Evelina Marmon. And in January 1896, she gave birth to her illegitimate daughter, Doris. She was a very popular 25-year-old barmaid, and she quickly started looking for offers of adoption. And like we talked about, she placed an advertisement in the miscellaneous section of the Bristol Times and Mirror. And the advertisement said, wanted respectable woman to take a young child. She wanted to go back to work and she wanted to get her child back. So she just wanted to like have somebody look over her child until she could get back on her feet again. And then she could go and reclaim her daughter. Next to her advertisement was the advertisement from Amelia Dyer, which said, married couple with no family would adopt a healthy child, nice country home, terms, and £10. So Evelina responded to that, and she was going back and forth with a Mrs. Harding. And this Mrs. Harding, she replied saying that they would love to, I should be glad to have a dear baby girl, one I could bring up and call my own. And she said, also in the letter, we are plain, homely people in fairly good circumstances, and I don't want a child for money's sake, but the company and home comfort. I and my husband are dearly fond of children. I have no child of my own. A child with me will have a good home and a mother's love. And so Evelina was very excited about that, but she couldn't pay £10 a week. She wanted something more affordable. But Mrs. Harding said that they wanted just a one-off payment in advance. And because Evelina was like in dire straits, she decided to finally pay those £10. And so Mrs. Harding, quote unquote, came to Cheltenham to pick up the baby. And Evelina was really surprised because she was so old, because Amelia was the one who showed up. But she saw that Amelia was affectionate towards the little baby. And so she handed her over along with a cardboard box of clothes and £10. But she was extremely upset about having to give up her daughter. And she followed Amelia to the station and then on to Gloucester. She really just didn't want to give up her child. And when she returned to her lodgings, everybody said she was like a broken woman. And a few days later, Evelina got a mail from Amelia, which was under Mrs. Harding, saying that everything was well. But when she wrote back, she never heard from her again. And so she had lied, of course, about where she was going. And she killed the baby probably that day. And they brought the clothes that Marmon had packed to a pawnbroker. And they were the ones that she was one of the ones in the carpet bag that, as you said, there was bricks for added weight. So when they dragged the river, that's when they actually found them. So I was wrong as far as that it was like found right after the package. So that was actually the murder that she was tried for. And that was the one that she had confessed to. She did not confess to any other killings.
That's right. And what's interesting is during that trial, she initially tried to use the insanity plea, but it didn't work. And neighbors testified that they'd often see her take up to 6 babies a day into her home. And yeah, she confessed. And this case actually helped change laws with regards to these baby farms. And it wouldn't be, I guess, a few decades before they realized, instead of baby farms, why don't we have orphanages? We could just call these orphanages or foster homes, and with the goal of what become today. I also want to point out that prostitution, going back to Jack the Ripper, was huge at this time. I mean, with women single, wanting to work, needing money.
Well, they needed money and they had no other way of doing it because where was the job? Like there was
Yeah.
no jobs. You couldn't work as a woman unless, of course, you were working as a maid or a
Yeah.
teacher. And from the poorer classes, you can't be a teacher because you didn't go to school. And it was hard being a maid. And so these women would have starved otherwise. So that's all they had to turn to was prostitution, which is horrifying. And again, going into women's rights, like one of the reasons why this case was so fascinating to me is because this just comes down to women's rights and the stigma of not having a man. And as you said, a lot of these men were married, were above class. Like a lot of maids were getting
Yeah.
impregnated by their employers. But I think under the law, you didn't have to put the name of the man down that
Right.
impregnated. Um, and I just find, however horrifying this case is, I find it fascinating by how little children were thought of in this time, as well as women. Like both the babies of these women and the women themselves were just disposable. And I think that goes back, again, to women's rights of not being able to actually work for yourself, right? And
Absolutely.
as you were talking about, like the government said, "Oh, hey, all you poor people, come work here for a pittance that you can't even feed yourself." Like,
Mhm.
I just, yeah.
It's interesting going back to the suspicions of the doctors back in 1879. Uh, she used to, with every death or every murder she committed, rather, she would fake cry when the coroner or examiner would arrive and check out what happened.
Hmm.
And the examiner, 9 out of 10 times, would just put natural death. So that's what enabled her for so long. It's also interesting to know in 1873, she has her second child. That's Marianne. And
Hmm.
then she has a boy in 1876. And then eventually leaves her husband later that year when her boy is born. So I don't understand. I don't know what the circumstances were for her leaving her husband. Maybe it was so she can continue acting in this way without having anyone over her shoulder. However, she did have an assistant and a woman that moved in with her to help her.
Hmm.
And the woman was always extremely suspicious of her. And she proved instrumental when the cops finally came down on Amelia. She offered a ton of information, just
Oh,
a
for her.
ton,
Yeah.
about the painkillers, about clothes, about she would go on these trips out of nowhere. I'll be right back. So she, again, I'm blanking on this woman's name, but she was extremely instrumental because she knew something was wrong, didn't want to get in trouble, needed the job. But then once the police came, it was
She
freedom.
was,
Like, I'll
yeah,
tell you everything.
exactly. She was like, "I'll tell you everything." So this horrifying person was, of course, found guilty in 4.5 minutes. And she spent 3 weeks in a cell and she filled 5 exercise books with her quote, last true and only confession. And a chaplain visited her the night before her execution and asked if she had anything to confess, and she gave him the exercise books. She was subpoenaed to appear as a witness in Polly's trial, set for a week after her execution date. Um, and so it was weird because they ruled that Dyer was already legally dead once sentenced and that therefore her evidence would be inadmissible. Um, she found out on the night that or the night before her execution that the charges against Polly had been dropped, and she was hanged at Newgate Prison on Wednesday, the 10th of June at 1896. And she
Yeah.
had nothing to say when she was asked. Now, as we said before, adoption laws were subsequently made stricter and gave local authorities much more power to police baby farms. However, of course, because, women's rights, we didn't get rights until what, the 1970s. So the
Yeah.
trafficking and abuse of infants did not stop. And actually, there was an interesting case where 2 years after her execution, Amelia's execution, um, railway workers found a parcel with a 3-week-old girl inside. She was thankfully still alive. And
Wow.
the daughter who had given the baby away, said that she had been given to a Mrs. Stewart for £12, and she had picked it up at Plymouth, and there was claim in the papers that Mrs. Stewart was actually Polly, the daughter of Amelia Dyer.
Wow.
So
Wow.
most people feel that the daughter was completely in cahoots with her mother, and
Wow.
that was the way she had been taught to make money. Again, at this
Yeah.
time where poor women like just could not work.
Yeah.
Um,
I mean, I think it was this philosophy or this ideology rather that Amelia developed that we're living in a time. Maybe she figured that these mothers don't really care. A lot of these mothers aren't returning to check on their babies. I can't support all these kids. I get the money, but also I think a lot of this has to do with her deep rooted loss of childhood. She had siblings who passed away. She finds herself taking care of her mother, and I think that there's a click. Something happens where it's like, maybe it's like protection. I don't want these babies to grow up in the same situation I did. Like everything's terrible. I was neglected, and so I shall inflict the same pain because there's something that you don't go 0 to 60 and kill all these babies
well,
over time.
I mean, my thinking is a little bit different, is because this was
Okay.
the 1800s, and like remember, this was the Victorian times, where like as the Industrial Revolution was starting to gear up, right? Or was it in the middle of the Industrial Revolution? Now I'm like, my
Yeah, that's
history
about
is
right.
going
That's
down.
about right.
So, I remember reading about that time. And okay, so the Industrial Revolution was from 1760 to 1840. So, I mean, this was the time of child laborers. Like parents had more children to send the children to work when they were 6, 7, and 8. There was this, the
Yeah.
way that we see kids now was completely different than the way kids were seen back then. And they were more of a way to make money, right? So sending them to the factories, or sending them out to the farms to work, or new nuisances of like, I don't have this many mouths to feed. And because there was, of course, no birth control,
Right.
there were families that had large amount of children. And I just think that
And
we
abortion
as
was deadly. Abortion was deadly
right,
at that time.
exactly. And so I think that just it was, yes, it's a stretch to kill so many babies because you are essentially killing something, but I don't think children were seen, I mean, the way that we see children now as these like precious objects to like kind of push through the world. So I do agree, obviously she was mentally deranged and came from trauma and abuse, to make her a serial killer of this magnitude. At the same time, I think the society allowed her to function like this because, again, for the
Absolutely.
first 10 years of her baby farming experience, she had male doctors signing off on
Yeah.
children who had been starved to death. Like,
Yeah.
what does that say about a doctor? And when you
Absolutely.
see like numbers and numbers of them. So I just, yeah, I mean, it's so hard to imagine what that time must have been like for anybody who didn't have money. I mean, between
Well, yeah.
like the diseases, the filth,
Very hard time.
the lack of any sort of resources, and what people were driven to survive. Like it's hard for me to kind of bring myself there. And then I'm like, well, of course, some crazy deranged woman who's like high on laudanum being like, hey, I'm going to get 10 pounds for a baby, like done. Because like 10 pounds back then was a lot of money. So this was
Yeah.
like, oh, this is a perfect scheme. And it's interesting because when they talk about serial killing women, they do tend to say like they kill for money. Like they need the money, whereas men have their own kind of vices. But for women, like if you think of the Black Widows, they're killing their husbands for money. So this was a woman who's like, oh, this is perfect. I have these beings that are just born and I can just, get rid of them really quickly and take the money.
I do
And
also find it interesting that, and also a lot of female killers fall under the category of in healthcare. You see a lot of nurses who kill elderly patients, right? When there are no doctors in the room, they put air into them, or nannies. There was the case of that British nanny with the death of the child. So I find that in addition to the money grab, there's also this thing where it's like not wanting the responsibility that's put onto them, and they don't know how to deal.
Yeah. But of course, in Amelia's case, it's like, I will take that responsibility for like a couple of hours so I can get my hands on the child so I can just take your money. And like, by the look of Evelina, these moms didn't want to be doing this. They just had no other choice. And
no choice.
First, when I was doing this, I actually thought that there was a law in the UK that said that unmarried mothers couldn't actually hold on to their illegitimate children. But
that's correct.
I couldn't find that law. So I'm just wondering if it was more societal pressures and standards, or did you find the law?
I think it was this law because of the stigma, right? Of being a single mother. Yeah, I think it goes back to this. They did it, and they're saying, wait, it's this. It's the. Excuse me, I just had it with 1830. I think it's that 1834 law. It was put into law. It's the 1834 Poor Law Amendment Act, which is where women are able to get food and help from the parish, and they can work for the government.
But they can't be a mother.
Correct.
That's okay. Right. So that was the law.
They can't be a mother if they're single or the child is illegitimate out of wedlock.
Okay. Oh, and because this is the parishes, then we can probably lay down this also pain on the church, whichever I guess is the Church of England, being so down on women, which again 100%. Is just, hey, and doesn't this sounds familiar?
It's
200 years later, and we're like, wow, okay, women's rights are getting flushed down the toilet by certain factions of our society, and there's always these horrible consequences of horrible, demented people taking it upon themselves to make money off of others' misfortunes. And this is, again, such a horrifying case, but also I do find it so fascinating because of the time. Like, I know a lot of people are so obsessed with Jack the Ripper, but like, this is to me like 100 billion times worse, and just kind of shows all the problems of society.
Really dark
heads.
just very dark, and it's incredible. It's incredible that she was able to get away with this for so long. And again, going back to your point about child protection, animals were protected both in North America and in Victorian England prior to children having any sort of protection. You weren't allowed to abuse your pet. You weren't allowed to just sort of toss their body into the gutter or whatever. You really had to respect your pet. No. But a baby, well, yeah. And, it does go back to today, because I don't know if you're aware of this horrible case where an African-American girl at age 13 in Mississippi, this recently happened, they do not allow abortion. And she was raped, and she was forced to have this baby. The nearest abortion clinic was so far away, she couldn't afford lodging. She couldn't afford to get there. Yeah. She just started 7th grade, and she has a baby.
Oh, I have no words. I just have no words. And we have so much history to go on of what happens when you don't have access to jobs, medical care, help for a child. Because guess what? These girls, they're not virgins with immaculate conception. There's a dude
Yeah.
on the other side of this. And it's almost
Yeah.
kind of like prostitution, where the
Yeah.
women are the ones that are arrested. Where are the
It's their
Johns?
fault.
It's their
It's
fault.
their fault.
Where are the Johns? Why aren't you going after the Johns? Oh, that's right, because they're dudes. So, and that's the same thing with the
Yeah.
doctors. Like, why didn't the doctors who had given her a pass for those first 10 years, like, why were they not put in as accomplices? Like, they're the ones that signed off on starving children. So
100%.
it's just
100%.
and again, going back to this horrifying case, I just find it so fascinating by how many of the themes that were going on back then for something like this to happen. We still have those themes. We still have those problems in society. We don't have the baby farms, but I mean,
we have sex trafficking, which is
yeah, exactly. So it's and just the men never seem to be and again, Amelia Dyer was a complete monster. But I feel that society enabled her to take away so many lives. Like, if that one doctor being like, hey, you've starved 3 children, I'm going to go call the cops on you.
Yeah, like, actually, this isn't a natural death, Amelia, you know?
Yeah. So I just, that,
and what's really creepy listeners, if you're out there, listen, go to Google and just look up an image of Amelia Dyer. She doesn't smile. There are these she is so creepy. I mean, you look at her and you know she's done something wrong.
Right.
It's really rare. You look at a killer, their mugshot or whatever, and you're like, oh, this is like bona fide. You look at her and you're like, she's either a really disgruntled postal worker. I don't know what it is, but you look at her and her eyes are just dead. And I think it's going back to healthcare and everything like this. If her mom received proper healthcare, maybe this would have helped change her life. Maybe she wouldn't have to feel at 11 years old, I have to take care of my dying mother. You know, and it just goes on and on, you know?
Yeah. And also
today.
I'm like, imagine how desperate the women had to be to hand over their newborns to a woman who looked like that.
Horrible. I know. I mean, I laugh just because it's astonishing. And I think it's a case that I'm really glad that we're talking about this case, because, you know, the information, I didn't see much out there, you know, and this is a case that definitely needs to be covered. You know, they have a lot of, the most prolific killer here, this woman is the poster lady for multiple counts of murder.
Yeah.
And I don't think she should not be forgotten. And I think it's really easy to forget her in this day of sensationalist serial killings, and it's happening all the time. We see it, but you do have to go back. And I remember in your early episodes where you're focusing on the Long Island murders, that had been going on forever and ever, and now we're starting to see some resolution to it. But you got to go back to these old cases, just because also it's interesting to see how authorities were working at that time.
Yeah.
The fact that these cops were like, whoa, okay, now we're going to do something about this, you know?
Yeah. And again, the doctors never flagging anything. And then it just shows how disposable women and children of a certain class were at this time. They weren't respectable. They, you know, were mothers out of wedlock, which again, going into religion makes them, you know, like illegitimate babies are like the worst thing ever, like a bastard. God forbid you're a bastard, right?
Yeah.
Like there's so much stuff in the Bible about that. And you're just like, that's
right.
a soul. It doesn't know that it's like born. And again, where the hell is the father? Like in all of this abortion talk now, currently, back then, I'm always like, what? It takes 2 to make a baby.
Yeah.
Where is the father? Where is the father? And why is he not being penalized for sleeping with a maid in, you know, under his household? Like, which again is also, you know, sexual harassment, because guess what? Can she say no? Probably
Right.
not, because she's
Probably
going to
not.
get
She'll lose that
fired
job.
and she won't be able
Yep.
to find another job. So it's like this case is just so interwoven with women's rights. And again, when women don't have rights or are looked down upon, they are then prone to falling in with these monsters. And it makes me think of the case in Vancouver with those hundreds of prostitutes that were killed, or sex workers that were killed by the pig farmer. Like, is it because they were sex workers? Again, this like idea of what a disposable person is in our society, which tends to be
That's
women, and then they're poor, and then maybe due to their trauma, now they're drug addicted. Like, it's just again, it's like the same problems, different year, like 200 years
Absolutely.
later. And it's just,
Absolutely.
I don't know. It's, and especially because we're seeing such a hard pull towards getting rid of women's rights. It's like, I think even more important to look at history and see what happened when women had very little rights.
Absolutely. I mean, the fact that this was even a law, right? With hand in hand with religion.
Yeah.
You can get help. You can go to the parish, but
can't be a mom.
You can't be a mom. You just can't be a mom. It's possible. We'll help you. And they didn't really. But this is it's shameful. And what's most shameful is you think you learn that we would learn from these events, from these cases. What a horrible society to allow that during Victorian England in the 19th century. But then also, who are we now? It's case by case, it's society by society. We pick and choose our battles. But you can't forget, in the 1970s, NYPD referred to murdered prostitutes and sex workers as non-human. On their reports, they would fill out non-human.
Yeah.
So that's only a few decades. We're only a few decades removed from that. And today they are still deemed non-human as far as I'm concerned.
Yep.
Man, again, it's a dark subject, but I'm happy that we're shining light on this subject because, we got to learn from this,
Yeah, exactly. Or at least have it be common knowledge that a monster can do something like this in the correct conditions. And obviously the correct conditions were happening because there were baby farms all over the UK, and as I said, Australia and the United States as well. So that actually existed, and that in itself is horrifying. I mean, just the existence of a baby farm is horrifying. And then, of course, you just need one demented person to take it to just the most horrifying conclusion. So
I don't know about you, but I've tried having conversations with my friends and family who are completely unaware of what a baby farm even is. No one believes me. No one believes me. They're like, you mean Cabbage Patch Kids? I'm like, no, we're not growing it's a baby farm. That's how shocking it is when people are just like, you're making this up. But it's no, I'm not making it up.
Yeah. And again, the consequence that mothers did not have the support to keep their children. Period. Full stop. And anyway. And so for somebody to have like 600 children at one time, like, where do you like, I don't even have the imagination to figure out like what that could possibly even look like.
And also what's interesting, Dominika, is like she herself is a mother.
Yeah. But again, I think that when you have a society that sees a large part of their population as disposable nothings, it's easy. And as you said, she came from a family that she could go to school. So, there's class issues in this as well. And, I mean, you see what the atrocities that happen in India with like their class situation goes with the untouchables. So it's like, again, it's such a microcosm, like, turned up to 100 of what could happen under these conditions. So, hey, we're back.
Hey,
with some darkness to start your middle of August with. Please let us know on Instagram and YouTube, like what you think about this, and do your research on the baby farms too, because it is such a horrifying but fascinating topic as to, again, like what we as humans permit to happen in our midst, in our society. And maybe we can go forward trying to change some of that. So I don't know if we can go any further than this episode. So I'm not sure what we're going to do next week, but it'll definitely be lighter than this. And again,
Impossible.
it's not possible to go deeper and darker than this one. And yeah, thanks for listening. And we're back weekly again. So check us out next week. And as I said, we'll try to do something a little bit more lighthearted when it comes to murder. If that's even possible. I don't even know.
Sounds good.
It sounds good until we're like, so we're doing a case of 20 people dead. I was like, oh, sorry. There's no lightheartedness in murder, except for if you're watching Only Murders in the Building. So maybe there's lightheartedness there in a cozy mystery. He got hit in the head with a candlestick. That's as lighthearted as murder gets, right?
Yes. Or accidental death's always good.
Accidental,
this one's fault,
Yeah, or the dude who falls over the cruise ship on his on his honeymoon. Is that lighthearted? I don't know. Sorry, it's a COVID brain. I just lost it. But thank you for sticking with us, and yeah, we look forward to hearing what you guys think about this episode. And see you next week. This episode was sponsored by The Creek Killer, Book 1 in the Harriet Harper thriller series written by me, Dominika Best. What would you do if you read The Police Found Your Body in a Creek? Find out in The Creek Killer, available on Amazon. Thank you for joining me and listening to this episode. If you like my show, please give me a rating and review. It helps other listeners find this podcast. Follow Dominika Best Presents The Deviant Mind wherever you listen to your podcasts. Visit thebeststorytellingnetwork.com, where you'll find show notes, my books, links to social media, and much more. Join my Patreon for special subscriber perks, like 2 extra exclusive episodes a month and a Q&A with me at patreon.com/The Deviant Mind Podcast. Until next time.